Why do men so often love these movies of the underdog, Rocky Balboa's, the stories where a man has to fight for something and fight for his honor and his reputation and his life. And I think men are called to that. We are to be driven and ambitious. And often our wives or our girlfriends or our mothers or sisters or daughters can try to hold us back from those, not understanding the masculine need to compete. Angie and I had this discussion last night because I had a 17,000 step day. And so I was showing my numbers to the girls and everything. And Angie had like 12. It was a good day for her as well. But I'm like, I got you, hon. And she's like, why does it have to be competitive? And I said, girl, first of all, you are competitive. So let's act like you're not. You're very competitive. But I said, that's how I'm driven as a man. It's mainly competition with myself first and competing for what I feel God's called me to. It's also competing for my youth as I age, to be as strong and as virile and as successful and as opportunistic as I was at age 30 as I get close to age 60. Trying to compete, not denying that life's making me older, and I'm not bemoaning that, but I want to be as active and as strong. I want to be like mom at 88 and walk an hour a day, right? I want to have that same mindset.
We are back after a bit of a hiatus. It wasn't planned. It was actually surrounding some very sad situations. My father-in-law passed away. He had esophageal cancer in 2019. It came back. And I don't think he ever really recovered, whether it was the esophageal cancer in the end or the chemo and radiation, as most of you know who've been through something like this. The cure for cancer is oftentimes as brutal as the cancer itself. So he passed away about a month ago now, and we obviously were out in Dan's hometown, very busy trying to support the arrangements and so forth, and with his siblings and his mother, of course, who unfortunately is not able to live by herself. So there was the double loss of the father passing and then mom having to be, literally the day after she buries her husband, she is told, Mom, you can't live alone. So how brutal that is as well. So just been a lot. Elliott and Angie and Warren and my mom were able to come to Muncie to the funeral, for Max's funeral. And it was a really beautiful and poignant and personal funeral, which is always what one hopes, that it can truly honor and reflect the void that this person will now leave in this earth. And at the gathering afterwards, Elliott and I were talking briefly about some of his thoughts and responses to the words that Dan and his brother Mark said. And I also wanted to share a little bit too, because at the end of the funeral, Dan was kind of emceeing at that point and passed the mic around, and several people spoke. And I didn't want to hop up because I thought, well, I've known Max for 14 years now, but I wanted to give everyone who's known him for his entire 88 years the chance to speak. And then I was getting my courage up, but I knew I was going to cry. And then I had that weird feeling of like, if you get up there and cry, everyone's going to feel sorry for you. And it won't be about Max, it'll be about you. So I had all this kind of stuff going in my head, but I was going to get my courage up and say some things about my father-in-law. And then Dan was like, okay, and passed it right back to the pastor. And I was like, dang it. So I had just all this regret. And when Elliott had just some striking thoughts about masculinity and manhood, and some of these old school men that sadly are passing on, and what they might be able to teach us as the next generation, and then us Gen X teaching the younger generations about what it means to be a true man and why that's important, and why this toxic masculinity doesn't necessarily need to be like that. And let's make sure we're not framing every masculine trait and characteristic as toxic inherently and in and of itself. So I thought, okay, this is my chance to redeem my missed opportunity to honor my father-in-law in conjunction with Elliott and his thoughts. So once again, my very long preamble and intro. I'm teeing you up now, Elliott.
Yes, so it was a beautiful funeral. I didn't know Max particularly well, probably talked to him 10 or 12 times in the decade or so. Not long conversations, but just he had a strong masculine presence. but I have been at a lot of male funerals of this era, this generation. I probably buried, as the pastor even, I probably buried, 10 of these World War II and Korean War guys who had their military experience. We would call them tough guys who really fought, not necessarily just physically, but nearly fought life to achieve what they achieved and to create what they create, to have dominion and authority and strength. And one of the reflections was there's often stories shared about these men, and Max Fitz, my father, our father Fitz, others from this era fit, where the things that we might now consider toxic about masculinity are praised and affirmed and celebrated, and not just by their compatriots of their era, by the grandkids and the great-grandkids. And so seemingly in retrospect and in reflection of these stoic, strong, tough-minded men, both Max and Simon being our dad, came from pretty strong poverty and busted their tail to create strong resources that they could pass down to their families and create a new legacy of provision rather than poverty. That in itself is a gigantic legacy change. That they weren't always the softest. They weren't always the most overtly affectionate and gentle. And the story Dan's brother talked about, where getting confronted and affronted by his father for disrespecting the mother. The time my dad challenged me to a fist fight in our backyard because he was sick of my attitude and my words, and I backed down. Mr. Tough, rebellious, obnoxious son who at that
you were
point
a teenager.
I was like 15.
He wasn't trying to beat you up at age 8. Let's be clear.
This wasn't a physical abuse story. This is like, do you want to fight? Like, and I know he was strategically just calling my bluff. And I know he didn't want to fight, and he didn't want me to fight him. He wasn't trying to invoke violence. He's trying to make a point, right? He's trying to say, will you please choose life, choose liberty, choose health, choose wholeness? And I remember when I said no, or I just shook my head or whatever, he just gave that grin he gave, like, this is all part of my plan here. And then went inside, just left me out there still to shoot baskets by myself. But I certainly shot in a different spirit, a different energy at that point. And I'm not saying it completely changed my life in that very instant or anything, but I do remember it as a significant demarcation line in my understanding of masculinity, my understanding of strength, even though our father was not a physically large man by any case. He was strong in spirit, strong in energy, strong in command, not strong in physicality. So it just got me stirring, and often the Lord does that to me in these kind of events that makes me start to move and create different ideas and different movements. And over the last 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks, even though we haven't recorded, I'm still doing all my sessions, and I've started to have a lot of these masculine conversations with my clients, the men and the women, and it's been really enlightening and very cool. So I started sharing them with you a little bit, Karen, including many of these guys saying, hey, when are you guys getting back on? What's going on? So that was good. But I wanted to bring some of these forward. And so I created a little document of some of my thoughts and movements. I haven't shared them with Warren and Dan yet. The two guys I want to share them with in particular, Warren being our older brother, because I really want to bring forth some type of retreat or weekend seminar or conference opportunity and have Dan and Warren right there with me, leading, teaching, sharing, understanding, small group atmosphere, break out the whole thing. So it's the beginning stages. I don't feel a sense from God when it's going to happen, but I know it's needed.
We are thrilled to announce our partnership with Authentics Athletic Apparel, spelled with 2 X's at the end because it's our XX chromosomes that make us female. And contrary to current belief, no amount of hormones, no number of surgeries can change that. And no female athlete should have to compete against men. But at the moment, this is exactly what's happening in both amateur and professional sports. It's not fair, nor is it safe. Wearing Authentics lets us take a stand to support and protect female athletes. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say it. We're protecting the future of womanhood. Authentics gives 10% of all sales to the Independent Women's Forum, the nonprofit which fights for women's causes, including our right to our own spaces and our right to compete against other women and only other women. Check out Authentics.com and use promo code LOVELIFE for 10% off your purchase. That's Authentics.com, AUTHENTIXX.com, and use promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 10% off your purchase. Let's highlight the strength bit. You alluded to Mark's story, which I was really struck by as well. I guess if I'm
Mark being Dan's older brother.
Yes, who is the tallest and biggest, which Max was also tall and big. And I guess as he became an adolescent, and as adolescent boys might do as they become physically more towering over their mothers now, he had at one point, he and his mom were kind of disagreeing about something, and he wasn't overt, like, I guess he kind of bumped into her. But Max saw that as him trying to physically overpower his mother. And I guess Mark said before he could even figure out what was going on, he was on his back and Max had pinned him down to the ground. Don't you ever, ever do that to your mother again. And so we're looking at strength of the father to protect. So with this toxic masculinity jargon and rhetoric, strength is always overpowering and domineering and being a bully. Whereas here, Max used his strength, even though his young son probably was getting to the point where he could go toe-to-toe with his dad on a physical level, but he used that strength to keep his child in check. Like, that is your mother. You will respect her. And Mark said he'd never, ever again for 1 second thought about using his physicality and strength as a man in any way to dominate a woman. How powerful is that? That strength, story. Like protection, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I know Mark said that he wasn't even aware, nor did he premeditate to physically intimidate his mother. It's just kind of one of those responses that happened impulsively in the moment.
Right.
And she might have accidentally turned into him even, right? It wasn't like he was going after her and trying to attack her. But nevertheless, it called the man, the leader of the family, the patriarch, the authority, the command, it called him into action. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the biggest points I heard in that funeral. And as we've talked at length about with our own father, and I've written about action, a man of action, a man is called by God to have dominion, to have some power and authority and leadership, and to create and to provide and to protect. And it's action-oriented things. Mm-hmm. What my client last night, he told me I could use this story because I was talking to him about it. He's wrestling through some stuff and he has been for a while. I've mentored him on and off now for 10 years. And so we were summarizing some of these issues and some of these things, and we were talking about discipline. And I told him, hey, I've known you a decade. You've yet to follow through on the discipline measures that you yourself have said you need to do. I said, you're sabotaging yourself. This isn't Satan. This isn't the Lord testing you. This is you not believing in you not going after you, right? And we just talk through those measures and those movements. And then he often laughs at and admires my crazy energy and my crazy movements. So he just kind of flippantly said as we were done, he's like, what are you doing now? He knew instinctively, even though it was 7:35 or whatever, I wasn't done with the day. I said, I'm going to mow the yard. And he goes, okay, I'm weed eating. And he got the weed eater out and weed eated for an hour and a half while I mowed. And I was thinking to myself again, here we talked a lot about discipline. We talked a lot about action. And now instead of getting in his truck and driving home and saying to himself, man, I probably should just helped Elliott. That'd have been kind of fun. He didn't think, he just did. He just acted. Mm. He got out the weed eater. And it was wonderful. I loved it. And we didn't talk during that whole hour, but we were hand in hand, man in man, taking care of a responsibility of my house. He joined me in action, in activity. I think that was a beautiful illustration, whether he intended it that way or not, of what changes he's trying to make in his life.
Yeah. And especially when you're talking about taking action and discipline, it is, of course, harkens back to my mug here, make it happen, which was, of course, Cy Anderson, one of his favorite adages, which was repeatedly
often given in command language, not a idea, a command.
Yeah.
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 Make it happen musically, make it happen athletically, academically, whatever it was.
Which when we look at the psych research, sometimes we think we have to have the feeling before we act or have the thought before we act. And sometimes we need to act and let the feelings follow. I don't really feel like doing ABC, whatever the discipline that the young man you were talking about has not been able to follow through on or has chosen not to follow through on. Sometimes you just do it and let the feeling follow.
That's right. And so you respond quickly. I'll weed eat.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't stop to think about what time I got to get home, what I got to do next, what I was just, nope, I'll weed eat. And he wasn't necessarily in work clothes. I went upstairs and changed into work clothes. He was in his same comfortable lounge clothes and navigated the poop in the backyard too as well while he's weeding because I hadn't had time to pick it up yet. So this men of action, this men of assertiveness, Karen, language I use with the men I work with all the time is don't say, I'll try to do that now. Because as soon as you give yourself the try, you're giving yourself the out. Well, I tried. Well, what does trying mean? I tried to get up on time and I didn't? No, you just chose not to. The alarm went off 6 times. You kept hitting snooze, snooze over and over. That's not trying. Trying is getting up. So rather than say try, just say, I will get up. Use the language, I will do this.
I've heard this. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard that there are some languages in some countries in Africa that don't even have the word try. You either do it, you don't. Trying is really irrelevant.
Answers in Abundance is now, I saw it online the other day, my first book I wrote is now been published in like 4 or 5 different African languages. So I don't know why or how. I don't have control over that book. Morgan James, the author, the publisher does, but I thought it was really cool. And I didn't even know there was that many different languages in Africa. That's my own ignorance. But it was pretty cool to see. And that makes me laugh that wonder how they perceive these different things. So I was telling this young man last night that preaching for me is a holy burden. It's not easy. I think about it all week long, praying about it, meditating about it, think about the congregation, what do they need to hear, what am I pulling back from last week, what am I doing this week. And after I was done preaching this past Sunday, Sarah, one of our new daughters, at the lunch table later said, "Why were you angry at us today?" I said, "Honey, I wasn't angry. I was serious. I was talking about how God's entrusted us with certain things and that we have to put it in the right perspective and have ownership of our stewardship, not ownership of what he has. God has everything, but our need to have stewardship and therefore be responsible and move." And I said, a majority of the people I know, myself included, are lazy Christians or want easy holiness. There are no such thing, right? Bonhoeffer says salvation is free, but discipleship will cost you everything. And that's so true. And so that was the seriousness of that message. And when I think about our father or think about Max, guys, again, who grew up really poor, right? That was a pretty cool story that Max didn't have a nice pair of shoes to take Linda out on a date. So he waited, right?
Well, it was even before that. It was her birthday party when she was like 3rd grade or something.
That's
And
so
they'd
cute.
started, I know it's so cute. They'd started going to school at the same school, and then he moved out to the country, and she still had a crush on him. And these Holloway girls, when they saw a boy they liked, they got their hooks in them.
Yeah.
She called the school, like a little child calls the school and asks the secretary to pull Max Abrell out of class so she can invite him to his birthday, birthday party. It's adorable. Yeah. But he didn't come because all he had is, and he would always say, a word that you and I heard from mom and dad too, all he had was a pair of clodhoppers, and he was too embarrassed. Yeah. And so here she is at her birthday party, like looking out the window. Where's that cute blonde boy? Is he coming? And he never did. But of course, it all ended well in the end. Yeah, it worked itself out. But it was really...
Both these men, Max and Simon, did not let their poverty dictate their future. It marked them. It identified a lot of their drive, their ambition. But both of them took risks too. Dad with his real estate ventures, Max switching out of contracting, going into owning Ponderosas. I mean, that was out of his field, right? He knew the buildings, he knew the operations, the engineering, but not employees and all that stuff, right? So I loved hearing the men of action, the masculine markers being about risk. Why do men so often love these movies of the underdog, Rocky Balboa's, the stories where a man has to fight for something and fight for his honor and his reputation and his life. And I think men are called to that. We are to be driven and ambitious and often our wives or our girlfriends or our mothers or sisters or daughters can try to hold us back from those, not understanding the masculine need to compete. Angie and I had this discussion last night because I had a 17,000 step day. And so I was showing my numbers to the girls and everything. And Angie had like 12. It was a good day for her as well. But I'm like, I got you, hon. And she's like, why does it have to be competitive? And I said, girl, first of all, you are competitive. So let's act like you're not. You're very competitive. But I said, that's how I'm driven as a man. It's mainly competition with myself first and competing for what I feel God's called me to. It's also competing for my youth as I age, to be as strong and as virile and as successful and as opportunistic as I was at age 30 as I get close to age 60. Trying to compete, not denying that life's making me older, and I'm not bemoaning that, but I want to be as active and as strong. I want to be like mom at 88 and walk an hour a day, right? I want to have that same mindset. And so it's this competitive spirit. And then spiritually, I am competing with Satan, not as by myself. You don't want to do that ever.
Don't take him on solo.
No, not that way. But in spiritual warfare, I know I'm a leader for Christ. I preach his word regularly. That in itself calls for spiritual warfare. And I'm trying to help young men in particular and couples survive tragedy, trauma, and crisis. I'm in constant spiritual warfare. Therefore, I'm competing with the devil by keeping my spiritual disciplines in place through prayer and worship and reading. And go ahead. I heard the breath, so I wanted to give you room.
When you talk about risk taking, are you, and the young men that you mentor, are you seeing some of that risk taking that we know is so character building? Even when you fail at a risk that you took or an opportunity didn't work out, you learn from it, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, you keep moving, you show yourself the character and integrity you have to have even had the courage to take on a challenge. Are you seeing some of that the younger generation are struggling with that kind of risk taking? I mean, they haven't had to go to war. I mean, there's some realities that, like you said, I mean, Dad and Max got drafted. They didn't want to go to war, but there they were. And so I don't know. What are you seeing as far as risk taking since you brought it up?
I think like age 32, 33 and down, meaning towards 18, 17, those young men I work with really have a fear of failure. Max and Dad's like, I'm going to buy an apartment and be a landlord. He had no clue, no background at all. And he just dove in. And it was a risk, and he lost money on it. And I went over there with him to help do stuff as much as I could. It was the start of my remodeling career. I was over there trying to figure it out with him, which is another great father-son story. I'm joining him in his risk and seeing, and this was a poor building in a poor area of Cincinnati. Was that not strategically Dad healing himself as well, trying to help others in their poverty make a better life? So, I mean, all those things sociologically, psychologically, I see now and understand. And so for this young man, for example, from last night, extremely creative and musical and funny and articulate. And he has big dreams for influence in his world in those areas, and yet can't consistently go after them. And he's making plenty of money and doesn't have a lot of responsibility or fear of that regard. So I'm always like, now's the time. A lot of people that I think in that middle generation, like age 30 to age 50, I don't see as much adverse effects by fear necessarily, but almost like afraid to dream, afraid to go after that vision that they feel maybe the Lord's called them to, or they're just feeling a compulsion to, and just afraid to take that next step, that next launch, and feel that undercurrent. And I think often, Karen, you and I have talked a lot about this, especially for those guys who are married and has kids, it feels way riskier to put your wife and your children through that potential loss and failure. And that is a different equation altogether. And in the spirit of oneness, biblically, your wife needs to be on board before you pull the trigger. I just coach wives, please hear your husband out and join him in prayer about what he feels the Lord is calling him to do. Because we don't want to, as spouses, deny or limit our husband from the very calling the Lord's asked him to. And quite frankly, if you read the Bible at all, is there a single male character from Genesis to Revelation that is not called to transformational movements? Leaving family, leaving friends, leaving work, following Jesus, all of it. And so if a man feels that biblical call, I'm not saying the wife has to like it, but please join him in prayer consideration. And more often than not, if the wife submits herself to the Lord and listens, if the calling is sincere and legit, it'll come to her as well. And now they're both on the same page and can help coach their kids on, hey, big changes might be coming. This is what we feel ready to do.
Well, it just speaks back to the leadership element. And that's something we probably need to devote an entire episode to, the husband and wife roles and how strong women can in fact still submit. And I know that's a dirty word in certain circles, but if a man is leading with grace and dignity and strength, a woman can lean into his leadership without feeling that she is anything less than, or she's inferior, or there's certainly a tension there that I think gets lost in some of the modern roles that feminism and again, men thinking that their male traits are toxic because they've been told that they are. That's probably an entire episode in and of itself. But that leadership element it was definitely something that Max and Dad also embodied and was certainly reflected and discussed at his service.
And I'm sure with Max, I don't know him as well. I didn't know him as well. But often the people underneath Dad didn't love his decisions or even like the way he was leading in particular moments. I was there as his drummer in many of his big musical productions, and I would see people in the choir or other musicians, when Dad wasn't looking, roll their eyes or give a little scoff or something because he was the conductor or the director and his vision was going to happen. You could get involved with it, you could connect with it, you could give some suggestions, but make no mistakes, it was going to be Simon's production. He felt the calling, he heard and saw what was supposed to happen. And it was always, not always, it was cool for me, is despite my frustration maybe seeing that occasionally, to then see them submit. And then see the result. Wow, quality, excellent production. And then later on, see them thank Dad for that and appreciate that command and that leadership. I tell this to wives all the time when they're telling me about their husband is too aggressive, too assertive. He wants to change jobs. He wants to move across the country. And I just ask them in a reflective question, something like, tell me which men on your shows or your videos or that you like to listen to or like to watch. And almost inevitably, it's that kind of activity. When they're watching a show, they like the men who are aggressive and challenging and risking all these things for their woman. And I'm like, well, why are you fine with it and actually endear it on the TV or the movie, and yet you don't want it in your own husband? It's like you want your husband to be boring and you want these men to be the action, and that's not how your man's called. He might be laid back, he might be introverted, but he's not called to be passive. And so it's trying to coach and teach in that rhythm as well. And that's not always easy. And if your father happened to be not strongly masculine and passive and maybe even dominated by his wife, and then you marry this aggressive, assertive husband, that is a really big change. And even if you were wanting that, to actually live in that experience is quite a drastic alternative.
As you know, we've been partnering with the Wellness Company for several months now. And personally, as someone who sadly no longer trusts the vast majority of medical professionals, I am so happy to be able to share the Wellness Company's array of products with the Love and Life community. Dan and I just purchased the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit, which includes vital medications with proven safety profiles like ivermectin, amoxicillin, and Z-Pak. The kit also includes a comprehensive guidebook researched and written by the company's chief medical board, including esteemed doctors who stood up to COVID tyranny, by the way, which is exactly why they've earned our trust. Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and Dr. Paul Alexander, just to name a few. Head over to twc.health/lovelife and enter promo code LOVELIFE, all one word, for 15% off your order. That's twc.health/lovelife and promo code LOVELIFE for 15% off your order. We can take charge of our health, and the Wellness Company is here to help us do it.
So Karen, one last aspect about Max and Simon, and Dan and I did get to talk about this a little bit at the pizza joint. Can't remember the name of the pizza place, but
Pizza King.
Pizza King. But we didn't get to flesh it out because Dan was appropriately, like you were, working the crowd and making sure everyone felt loved and affirmed. But legacy, right? Was there any doubt for you, even as a woman, but especially for Warren and I, after Dad passed, what our legacy was what were you supposed to do to honor Dad's legacy? It was so clear, crystal clear, though Dad didn't specifically say it. Doc Ryder did say it to me before he passed, one of our mentors here on campus, which I'm sure he probably did with Warren as well. He was very specific in that, but Dad wasn't necessarily, but we knew the legacy. Teach and coach and mentor and challenge and shape and mold and influence every day, every second, never stop. That was clear, and I think Warren and I still do that. I could see as Mark spoke and Dan spoke, they were feeling the weight of Max's legacy a little differently, but both feeling appropriate sadness and mourning and yet inspiration, which is what we want for life, that when we leave, our kids and our community are actually inspired to take what elements of their life fits and applies, but especially for sons, they know clearly how to follow that legacy that Max had. You work your tail off, you invest, you protect, you connect, you lead, you mentor, you shape, you mold. And Dan does that. I don't know Mark and the other son very much at all, but Dan does that, and I'm sure he's more inspired to do it than ever. So that legacy piece is huge. I work with many men who are in similar age groups to me, whose fathers are passing or have passed recently. And I talked about it with one of my guys last week, and I asked his permission as well. Could I talk about this a little bit? His dad was difficult, not as kind as Max and Simon. Similar strength, similar toughness, but a lot of meanness, a lot of abusive type behaviors. I just got to call it what it is. And so we were talking, and he was grieving and sharing with me and talking about carrying out that legacy of his father, which some might be confused about. Why would you carry out certain aspects of his legacy? Because that's how we're wired. Think of the Jewish history and how important the sons were to the father and the inheritance and the estate. And then they automatically took over if dad died, took over for the mom and the siblings, and especially the women. And this man is feeling that with his mom, and he's doing well with that, and his younger sibling. He's the oldest. He is the new patriarch. And we were just talking about the weight of that, and that he can carry forward. His dad wasn't a believer till the very end, where this man's been a believer for a while. And so he can now carry forward the legacy without mimicking the negatives, but the drive, the work ethic, the strength, the provision, we're all rock solid. And we talked about the variable elements of legacy carrying. And I'm sure it's a conversation for women, but I think it's almost marked in our DNA as men.
Well, especially the father-son relationship, as you spoke to. So I feel the burden to carry on Dad's legacy too. Burden's probably too strong a word. That I want to carry the torch. And I felt that very acutely, even as a daughter. But I think certainly for sons and their father as they are moving forward. But, really, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's really what I had wanted to say. And I felt very sad, had a lot of regret, in fact, that I didn't say it, was that even though I met Max, we've been married 12 years, and I met him, I guess, like 14 years ago then, part of my grieving was, man, I wish I'd known him longer. And that was painful. I didn't expect that. I mean, I guess I should have expected it, really, when you love someone so deeply and you see what an impact they've had on the kids they've raised and the community, that you would be a little sad that you hadn't been able to be part of his world earlier. And just, especially because by the time I showed up, he had that more gentleness than some of that, which he had to, like we talked about, that strength that as a father to check his kids when they needed it and correct them when they needed it. But I definitely see, and I wanted to say to those who had attended, that his legacy obviously is, Dan is living out his legacy. And though I didn't know Max of 30-year-old Max, 40-year-old Max, 50-year-old Max, I certainly see him in my husband and the love of my life, and what a gift Max gave me through Dan. And that was what I wanted to share. And so just the grieving of not having had the chance to know him longer and better, but just so much gratitude for the man that he was, and those character traits and that integrity and that sense of honesty and fidelity, just that he instilled in Dan, which I'm the beneficiary of all that. And I just felt so grateful and blessed.
Yeah, and we certainly are huge fans and proponents of the importance of mothers. And the attachment theory is pretty clear that the mama bond's even a little more important early on. That strength is huge, obviously. And so we love mothers, support mothers, but mothers rarely get criticized for their mothering style. And many men are criticized for being tough on their kids. In fact, many wives step in and try to stop their husbands from giving that direct masculine challenge to their sons. And so I'm often coaching wives and husbands. If you trust your man and you believe in him and he is accountable and he is responsible and he's providing, give him freedom to masculinely raise your kids. It's not going to look like yours and how a woman does it and how a mother does it. So it's just championing that piece of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the two different energies that the fathers bring to their parenting and mothers bring to their parenting. And it's distinct, and I think it's important.
And a lot of couples accidentally, most of the women I know who are doing this, blocking their husband's leadership over the family and the children, don't mean to. They don't want to. It's so different. They're afraid of it and fearful it's going to be like irrefutable harm. Just the way men, especially with their young boys, men tend to wrestle and roughhouse with their young boys fast. And I know there's many wives go, oh my gosh, please don't break an arm. Please don't break a leg.
Right.
And I'd say, well, even if that happened, then what? Does it mean he's cruel? Does it mean he's abusive? No, it meant he was playing rough with his son and something weird happened. Right. And so I'm not trying to, again, say men should be risk takers and like throw their kids up 40 feet in the air or something. But remember George Rogers doing that with his kids?
Yes.
Right. It's
his girls. They were girls too.
Literally 15, 20 feet in the air.
Yeah.
And
Cresta and Brooke.
Wow. I knew you'd pull something out there. Wilma. Was his wife Wilma? No.
There was a Wilma though. We're going back to our childhood,
our church
American
days. But
Baptist
again,
church.
I can distinctly remember that as a young boy watching this Gilda launch his kids way up in the air. And I loved it. I never saw or heard Gilda once scold him or get on his case about him. He's a loving father, big, strong man. And the girls loved it. And that was a cool, and looking back, that's a cool reflection on a woman who's probably saying, I would never do that. I would never throw my daughter 20 feet in the air. And letting her husband be her husband. And he seemed like, I don't know him well enough to know, and I don't know his kids well enough, but he seemed like an awesome dad. Totally. That's just a little example from our past. It just came to my head because I knew you'd remember. And of course, you pulled the names out as well. So
You're welcome.
So just a little reflection on how we were both stirred from Max's funeral and the connection and some of the movements I feel the Lord's asking me to be involved with down the road. And then how I've been able to put some of that into action in my therapy immediately. So that's been very cool.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
All right, let me pray. Lord, we thank you for the life of Max. We thank you, Lord, for the testimony, the legacy, the husbandry, the fathering, his work in the community, his willingness to sacrifice, Lord, and use his skills for so many different people. I love the story, Lord, that in his 80s, he was up on a ladder, reaching backwards over his head, working on some gutters. I just thought that was awesome. Was it risky? Of course. Was it maybe stupid? Yes, but he was a man being a man, using his gifts and feeling called to help others. And fathers, it stirred my heart about masculinity in general. And as Dan and Karen and I have had conversations and Warren, we need more masculine training. We need more opportunities for men to be fully male, fully masculine, which often will be fully assertive and a little rougher, a little tougher, teaching them, Lord, to not be afraid of failure and to embrace intelligent risk, to dream and to take leaps of faith and to follow our biblical heroes. I think, Lord, of the cost it is just to follow you. And you're very clear to us, Lord, when we follow you, truly follow you, we might have fallouts with all kinds of things and all kinds of people. And yet we are honoring your priority, your position that's preeminent in our lives. So we just thank you, Lord, for this time to talk very briefly about a great man who lived well and is with you now in heaven forever. Amen.